everyone, this is going to be just a short video that is an introduction to empiricism. So, yeah, let's dive right into it. Historically, when people say that the empiricists, and generally they're going to be referring to the British empiricists of basically the period that we're discussing. But in general, what empiricism means is that empiricism is the belief that the most fundamental or foundational kind of knowledge that we have is knowledge that comes from sensation, perception, and experience. So one reaction that you might have to, to some extent from Descartes, but especially from Spinoza and Leibniz, is just that things have gotten out of hand. That there's far too much philosophical investigation of the nature of substance, of the nature of God, of what it's like to see things from a God's eye perspective, all of this stuff that seemingly we have very little to no access to. And so you might think that, like, philosophy here is just sort of really off to a wrong kind of starting point. It's like they almost want to begin from knowledge that we do not have, right? Knowledge about the perspective that God has on objects, and then use that to inform the knowledge that we do actually have, which is largely knowledge from sensation and experience. And even, Leibniz, for example, in the Monadology, was perfectly willing to say that we are an empiric, which means just an empiricist in 3/4 of our actions. And so that might be one reaction that you might have had to the last, 5, 6 weeks of class. And that would not be an unusual reaction. There are plenty of philosophers who have felt the same way, and it's worth sort of investigating why they felt that way and potentially interrogating some of the methodological problems that we saw in Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. So, British empiricism as a project is roughly contemporary with the rationalists we've read from the, kind of 1680s-ish to 1740s-ish. And the reason why we refer to, like, this specific period as being like, oh, these are the empiricists, rather than just saying that they are some empiricist philosophers in a long history of empiricist philosophers, is that these were philosophers that were empiricists during the development of modern natural science, right? And this is basically the same thing that differentiated all the other modern philosophies, that it's a response to the developments of modern natural science. And so empiricism as a label actually applies to a whole range of figures. You can talk about ancient Greek empiricists, you can talk about, Indian atomists or materialists or empiricists, from a long time ago, from antiquity, right? But what differentiates this specific period of empiricists and why we're likely to, if somebody just says, oh, I like the empiricists, they're probably talking about this period, is because these figures sort of developed a paradigmatic modern interpretation of empiricism that people are still interested in today, that is an attempt to work out empiricism in light of the findings of the modern natural experimental sciences. And so you can see some of the sources for the development of this period come from Bacon, who we read way back in the first week of the semester, who talked about the importance of experimentation and the idea of a scientific method and so on. But also Descartes, because Descartes sort of began this rigorous sort of skeptical approach towards our current knowledge, right? And this sort of revived the importance of epistemological questions. So questions about the status and source of the knowledge that we have. Now, importantly, empiricism is not the claim that the only source of justification comes from sensation, perception, and experience. All of the empiricists, for example, were willing to concede that mathematics does not use perception or sensation, but they, unlike the rationalists, doubt the ability of mathematics to work as a model for other kinds of knowledge. So what do I mean by that? So like whenever we do mathematics, we don't need to have like a mental picture of what's going on in order to do the math, right? So like I can do mathematics in extremely large quantities, like quadrillions, right? Which I have no ability to sort of develop a mental picture or representation of, right? But the rules governing mathematics apply just as well to the quadrillions as they do in the, smaller numbers that I can visually represent in my brain, right? And so what that clearly shows is that mathematics is not justified by our experience. Mathematics is a structure, and it's something that we can use to figure out relations between quantities, right? And even the empiricists were certainly willing to concede this, willing to say, okay, mathematics, it doesn't work from sensation, perception, and experience, right? But what they will say is that mathematics is extremely limited as a tool, right? If mathematics only tells you about relations of quantity, then there's no reason really to think that mathematics will be able to tell you, say, about the nature of fundamental reality or something like that, or that you can start like doing metaphysics as if you were doing mathematics, right? And that's basically what, to some extent, Descartes, but especially Spinoza and Leibniz were attempting to do, is to try to build up metaphysics as if it were a science akin to mathematics. So that's important. They don't reject all kinds of knowledge. They don't come from perception, sensation, or experience. They just say that that's not really foundational kind of knowledge, right? And the reason why we're concerned with these foundational kinds of knowledges is because we're still interested in answering Descartes' initial skepticism, right? We're still interested in figuring out, okay, what kind of knowledge do we have? What are its sources and justification, and how far does it go, right? And so basically the empiricists, rather than starting with some axiom or definition like substance is the causa sui, or something like that, they're like, okay, well, let's begin with an investigation of our perspective as human beings, our ability to sense and experience things, and sort of build up a theory from that point. And so importantly, this also means that rationalism is not the claim that the only source of justification comes from the use of reason. All of the rationalists who we read, for example, were very concerned with physics and experimental sciences. I mean, Descartes, he had his own investigations into physics. Princess Elizabeth was interested in it. Amo was interested in how sensation happens. Spinoza has his own physical theory. Leibniz has his own physical theory and developed calculus, right? And so it would be wrong to just say and also just sort of unfair, right? Like they made important developments in the natural sciences. So to say that they didn't care about it, right? This is just not right. They did care about it, right? They just claimed that these sort of investigations are grounded by metaphysics, that metaphysics makes them possible, right? Whereas the philosophers that we're going to be investigating, the empiricists, they're going to claim that if metaphysics is possible, if we can, examine fundamental reality, then we have to do so by beginning from a human standpoint and investigating the limitations of the knowledge that's possible for us. No, so this is related to really, I think, two ways of interpreting the development of modern science in Copernicus, Galileo, Bacon, Kepler, and Newton. One way of like seeing these figures would be to say that the most important aspect of their discovery was the mathematization of the universe, right? It's like a lot of these principal developments in physics come from astronomy, right? By charting mathematical relations between the planets and developing a model for the galaxy or the universe, right? And this is what the rationalists picked up on as the most important dimension of modern science, right? And they try to develop that, make their own metaphysics out of it. They can explain how it is that we can engage in these sort of explanations, right? But another way of interpreting the development of modern science is to say that it's not really so much about the mathematization of nature, or at least that's not the primary and most important dimension of it. Actually, much more simply, the more important dimension of the development of modern science is actually just experiment, right? And this is something that Bacon brought up quite a lot in the readings that we did for the first week, is that on this interpretation, what really makes the modern approaches to natural science different is not, you know, the mathematization of nature, but is instead really about, okay, you know, developing a rigorous, robust scientific method, developing institutions that can actually support scientific investigation, right? There's development of a lot of universities and university systems all across Europe, right, at this time, and standardization of approaches, right? And that really this, more than anything else, is like the most important dimension of modern science. And so what we're left with is that the empiricists generally stem from like the United Kingdom, and in general this is related to a phenomenon called the Scottish Enlightenment that occurs during the 18th century. And this is pretty, I don't know, pretty interesting or funny, because I think that we tend to think now about like German philosophers as being like the most erudite and, I don't know, heady or something like that, right? But just as a funny piece of trivia, Kant, the last author that we're going to be reading for this course, who was German, he actually would claim that he had Scottish ancestors and that he was really Scottish. It was like, now you would lie about having German ancestry if you're interested in doing serious obtuse philosophy or whatever. But Kant himself, he lied about being Scottish because he had such high estimation of the philosophical accomplishments of the authors of this period. And so in general, the empiricists are from like the UK, they're from Scotland, they're from Britain, right? While the rationalists are in general from the continent, so continental Europe, so France, Germany, Holland, stuff like that. Nevertheless, they were in conversation with one another pretty frequently. The way that the course is divided, so that we do like the rationalist for the first half and then the empiricist kind of for the second half of the semester, it's a little misleading chronologically, because Locke was really writing at the same time as like Spinoza and Leibniz. Leibniz even wrote an entire like book-length commentary on a book that Locke published that was about Locke's epistemology, and Leibniz was essentially sort of like, no, you're wrong about everything, so that's kind of funny. So the way that we're teaching it is a little bit not chronological, right? We decided to go through all of the empiricists and then all of the rationalists and then all of the empiricists. But really, if we were going strictly chronologically, then things would be a little bit more complex, and we would shift from one to the other. To some extent, the split between rationalists and empiricists is interesting because it prefigures a later split that happens in philosophy between analytic and continental philosophy. This is primarily like a Western philosophy thing. It happened during the 20th century, where basically what happens is more or less after World War II, um, the UK as well as America, like there's a lot of basically Marxist philosophy coming from Europe, right? And they're like, oh, this stuff is terrible. We need to sort of reinvent philosophy so that it's not sympathetic to communism, right? It becomes sort of this McCarthyist project. And so part of the development of analytic philosophy was, okay, we're going to reject all of this stuff that comes from continental Europe, right? We're going to revive the traditions of empiricism, right? And it's going to be like a strictly Anglo-American phenomena. So if you go to like most any department in the United States, if they're teaching like contemporary philosophy stuff, almost all of it will be Anglo-American, right? UNM, luckily, is one exception where we actually teach a pretty wide variety, not only of Western philosophy, but also non-Western philosophy. So that's, kind of interesting, just as a little historical tidbit. Another thing to note is that there are actually quite a lot of empiricists. We're going to be primarily looking at a big three. So, the sort of big three rationalists that we looked at were Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. For the empiricists, we're going to be looking at Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. And the next video will get more into the details of their specific positions. So, but there were actually like quite a lot of philosophers during this period that were empiricists. I mean, arguably Newton was himself a philosopher and himself an empiricist during this time. Oh yeah, another aspect of sort of the bitterness between rationalist and empiricist philosophers is that Newton claimed that Leibniz had plagiarized the calculus from him. And this sort of like basically ruined Leibniz's whole life. It got sort of I don't know, it became sort of like a nationalist thing, like, oh, the people from the UK, like they're the real experimental scientists, or the serious intellectuals, right? Whereas all the German people are like backwards, right, compared to developments coming out of the UK. So these are, some of the general features of empiricism. And so before we move on to the next video and start talking about the specifics of each of their approaches, I think that it's important that we talk about just a little bit of terminology. And in general, as you might imagine, because the empiricists say that the most significant source of our knowledge is from perception, right? That they're really concerned with a philosophy of perception. So they're thinking about things that Descartes was thinking about in the first meditation, but thinking about it in a little bit of a different way than he was, right? You might consider optical illusions, and I'll try to edit in a couple optical illusions at roughly this point, just so that you can see them, right? And one thing that's important about thinking about perception and optical illusions is that we replace the language of true and false with the language of veridical and non-veridical. So whenever we say that we have a veridical perception, what that means is the way that we perceive it corresponds to the way that things actually are. And the reason why you use that instead of true or false is because it's a little bit weird to say that a perception is true, right? Whenever you look at an optical illusion, right, you see the illusion, but you don't judge, you don't consciously believe that the world is like the way that the illusion is presented to you, right? And so you believe, in the case of optical illusions, that your own perception is non-veridical, that it doesn't accurately represent the way that things really are. But if you look at an optical illusion and you just have the language of true and false, it's a little bit weird, right? Because you want to say that the way that you're seeing it is like true to some extent, and the way that that is the way that you're actually perceiving it, right? And so that's why the language of true or false, that's better used to refer to judgments, right? Whenever you say, this is the way that the world really is, that can be true or false. But seeing something a certain way is not the same way as judging it to be that way, right? When we see an optical illusion, we fall into the illusion. We see things the way that the optical illusion like intends us to see them, right? But we don't then judge that that's the way that things actually are unless we don't realize that it's an illusion, right? And so veridical perceptions is perceptions that are normal, that are working well, that correspond to the way that things really are, right? And non-veridical perceptions are perceptions that do not accurately track or reflect reality in an important way. Um, so that's going to be important terminology for the future. Another piece of important terminology is going to be the distinction, and we've talked about this a little bit, between a priori and a posteriori kinds of reasonings. So a priori just means prior to experience, right? Prior, right? That's really where it comes from. Whereas a posteriori, here you might guess, posterior, right? Afterwards. In this case, that just means after experience, right? And so people will typically use this as a modifier for knowledge. They'll say a priori knowledge is knowledge that you have without any relevant kind of experience, right? So mathematics, right? Mathematics is a priori. I don't need to experience a quadrillion things and 5 things to know that a quadrillion plus 5 is a quadrillion and 5, right? That sort of reasoning is reasoning that I can do independently of everything that I've experienced. Similarly, like the cogito, right? Descartes interprets the cogito as a sort of a priori knowledge. You can know that it's true whatever your sensations, perceptions, or experiences are, right? Whereas a posteriori knowledge, this is knowledge that you get from experience, right? So like to know the color of something, to know the shape of it, to have a really nice day. These are sort of a posteriori experiences. Okay, so in the next video we're going to go over the specifics of some of the empiricists you are going to read for this week.